Thanks very much for the invitation. I've really enjoyed the conference, and thank you all to Ravi and all the organizers. This is joint work with Xavier Giné, who you heard from earlier, Jess Goldberg, who is a former student of mine now at the University of Maryland, and Dan Silverman, a colleague of mine at Michigan. I'd like to share with you two very important facts about development and human well-being in Malawi, which we can take as motivation for the study that I'm about to share with you. The first fact is about investment on farms, and in particular investment in fertilizer, and that is that, well, let me show you in a second. And the second fact is going to be about consumption smoothing, in particular over the lean or hungry season in Malawi. So here's the first fact, the big picture point being that fertilizer utilization in Malawi is substantially below optimal levels. So on the vertical axis here, we have percentage of our sample population in central Malawi, and on the horizontal axis, we have different categories of individuals, farmers categorized by their use of fertilizer per acre on their maize plots in ascending order. The vertical red line here represents the government's official recommended level of fertilizer use. And what we can see is that the biggest single category is the 0 to 9 kg per acre category, which is the very lowest level of fertilizer utilization. About 17% and a very small number of people are at or above the optimal level. But basically the point being that about 4 out of 5 farmers in rural Malawi are substantially below optimal levels of fertilizer utilization. Now this is the government recommended level. It may vary a little bit from what the actual level would be if you conducted proper agricultural studies in this context, but I think any change in what that optimal level is likely to be is not going to take away from the basic point that farmers in Malawi are dramatically underusing fertilizer. The second big fact is about consumption smoothing and how it's quite dramatically uneven over the course of the year. Malawi is a context where there's only one harvest per year in about May or June. As you can see here, in May or June of each year, caloric consumption, and the couple of months after that, July and August, are the months when caloric consumption is the highest in this nationally representative study. And the level of caloric consumption, by contrast, is about 20% lower, at least in these data, in January, February, March, particularly February and March, which is basically the time of year when food stocks that had been accumulated in the previous harvest are at their very lowest levels. So quite dramatically imperfect consumption smoothing over the course of the agricultural year. What we're interested in is what might link these two very, very dramatic facts about development and human well-being in Malawi. There are obviously many possible explanations for these two facts, but what we're interested in is the possibility that individuals know they should be using higher levels of fertilizer, know they should be smoothing out their consumption better over the course of the year, and perhaps even make plans to do so, but fail at the last minute once the time comes to actually implement that plan. And here's some evidence, at least in the context of fertilizer utilization, that we think supports that idea. So this is basically data showing that people quite dramatically fail in large proportions to carry through or to follow through on plans that they make initially to use fertilizer on their plots. So what we did in our data was we surveyed people in November of a particular year, November of 2009, and we asked them, in the planting season, which starts next month, and where most of the fertilizer application is going to happen in the next month, December and January of 2009, 2010, how much fertilizer are you going to use? So this is, first point to make is that this is very close to the start of when they're actually going to be using fertilizer, and within 2 months of when they'd actually be applying all of their fertilizer over the course of the first 2 months of the planting season. And what we're showing here is on the vertical axis we have percentage of our sample, and on the horizontal axis the categories are actual use, which we determined via a survey several months later, as a proportion or as a percentage of how much you plan to use in November, just 1 month before you were supposed to start using fertilizer. And the key point is that the majority of farmers, a slight majority, 51%, are in these categories that represent use that's less than, somewhat less than, and in most cases, dramatically less than their planned use. So the biggest single category, to be fair, is 100%. About a quarter of farmers are in that category. By the way, it shouldn't be surprising that these numbers are fairly lumpy. You've got a lot of people reporting exactly 0, exactly 100%, exactly 50%, and that just derives from the lumpy nature of fertilizer purchases. You typically buy 0, 1, or 2 bags, 50 kg bags of fertilizer, so we shouldn't be surprised at this lumpiness. And another 21% actually report using more than the target. So 49% are actually using at or above their target. But we're interested in this slight majority of people who are using less than plan, and in most cases dramatically less than plan. 15% using only 50%, and another 14% using 0. I mean, basically planning to use some non-zero amount of fertilizer, and then in literally just for the next couple of months using nothing. What are we interested in here? So this basically leads to our key question of the paper and the study: why don't people follow through on plans that they make in advance? Or put it a little bit differently, and sort of more to the point of what we do in this study, when people make commitments to certain future plans, what explains why they revise those plans later? And this is a question that I think should be clear to everyone, that has many implications for development and human well-being in the developing world, and of course as well in the rich world. It has implications for investments of various kinds, investments in agricultural inputs, small business capital, education, health, where you need to make some sort of plan in advance, and then of course follow through with that plan once the time comes to implement. And it's also very important for consumption smoothing, particularly in contexts where there's just one crop a year, like in Malawi. You need to gradually draw down your food stores over essentially a 1-year period, particularly in the lean period right before your next harvest is coming in, when food stores are typically most highly depleted, and you're very much closer to the margin of not having food stores at all. And I mentioned consumption smoothing in particular because that's going to be, in particular, the context in which we do this experiment, where the choice that we examine is about smoothing of consumption over the course of Malawi's hungry season. Let me say some important words about present bias, often referred to as hyperbolic preferences, because the most common answer that is typically given, and we believe rightly so, to the question I just posed is that it's because people have present biased preferences. So they have the foresight to be able to make an advanced plan. They realize they should be making some advanced plan, but when the time comes, they don't actually follow through on that plan. So what do we mean by hyperbolic preferences? Just so we're all on the same page, we mean a declining discount rate, a rate of time preference that declines over time when you're comparing choices in the immediate future versus choices that refer to some future date. So in practice, this means, for example, not willing to defer consumption or to save today, but perhaps being willing to do so if you're thinking about saving at some future date or reducing consumption at some future date. Hyperbolic preferences have gotten a great deal of attention in development economics and elsewhere. And they have a number of very, very important implications. First being time-inconsistent behavior. Essentially what I just said, that individuals, because they have lower rates of time preference in the future, will make plans for investment or saving or some other action that they think will better their lives at some future date. But once the time comes to implement the actions associated with that plan, they will be inconsistent vis-a-vis their original plan. That's what we mean by time inconsistency. This can be, this is often seen as problems of self-control, and can lead to demand for commitment devices. But importantly, which I think is an important point in the context of what I'll be sharing with you today, that demand for commitment has to come with, or has to derive from individuals who have at least some degree of sophistication about their self-control problem. It isn't going to show up if people are fully naive about that self-control problem. Just as a brief review of the literature, there are responses in many lab experimental settings that are consistent with hyperbolic discounting. I'll talk a bit more about that in a bit when I talk about how we measure it. And some very recent work has sought to link hyperbolic preferences with demand for commitment. So Nava Ashraf, Dean Carlin, and Wesley Yin in a highly regarded and widely cited 2006 paper find that present bias women have a higher demand for a commitment savings product. This is a very important finding, very important result, and justifiably highly cited because it's one of the first pieces of evidence actually linking survey-based measures of present bias with an actual financial action, a real-world financial action with real consequences. So my co-authors and I are very interested in this topic, and we have another study that I should mention with a couple of the same co-authors that actually don't find this in Malawi, in a sample of male tobacco farmers. We won't talk too much about that, but what I want to talk about is another study that's linked to that, which I'll turn to in just another slide. So what are the gaps in our current knowledge? Now that I've given you a brief sense of where the literature stands on this topic, one important, the key gap that's motivating this research is there's actually no direct evidence that links present bias preferences with a failure to actually carry out future plans. And so what we do in this work is we take quote-unquote revision of a previous decision as the fundamental behavior of interest. This is going to be our dependent variable. And I think the important sort of distinction we want to make is vis-a-vis taking demand for commitment as the dependent variable of interest. We think demand for commitment is a useful outcome to examine, and we've gotten a great deal of insight from looking at demand for commitment. I've done this myself in the previous study. But it may understate self-control problems, specifically because, as I mentioned before, it requires some degree of sophistication on the part of the study participant to actually demand a commitment product. So what we're going to be doing is actually going to be by contrast, in our study, we're going to be able to look at revisions of previous decisions, and all of our analyses are going to be robust to naivete. In other words, we're going to be able to look at actions by individuals who don't have to be self-aware about their self-control problems. So we're basically going to, so that's one key distinction we want to make vis-a-vis previous work. And I should say that this is probably, as far as we're aware, the first study to actually do this, to actually take revision of a previous decision as the dependent variable. The second point that we want to make is that the current literature hasn't actually done a thorough systematic job of trying to understand other determinants for revisions of previous decisions, other reasons why people might revise or go back on plans that they made previously. We agree that it's very important to look at the impact of present bias, but what we want to add is to look at the impact of other factors that may be leading to revisions as well. And we think it's important because it has key implications for policy that you might derive to help people if we think we want them to be able to stick to their plans, and also affects welfare analysis of whether it's useful to help people commit to plans in the first place. So actually, some of the other determinants may actually suggest that revisions may be good in some circumstances, and therefore that could be a potential downside of commitment devices. All right. So what are these other potential determinants of revision that we're talking about? So the first is obviously present bias preferences, which the current literature has focused on almost exclusively. There are three others that we're going to look at. The first is social pressure. Maybe I make a plan to invest in fertilizer or to smooth consumption over the hungry season, but the social network makes demands on my resources during that time because they know I have resources available and causes me to run down my stored food more quickly. And in particular, in this work, we'll be looking at spousal preferences. So not necessarily the broader social network, but just one spouse, which are many stories about There are many stories in the microfinance and other literatures about how spouses can potentially have a negative influence on one another in terms of their ability to follow through with plans. The next is shocks. So this is a very simple point that sometimes when people make plans, they're actually probably in some cases appropriately thought of as contingent plans. Plans that are conditional on the state of the world remaining the same, but not in a state of where someone might have died, had a major health shock, or where there may have been a big income loss. So certainly shocks could lead people to revise their previous plans. And finally, very simply, mistakes. For example, people with low financial sophistication may make a certain plan, an investment plan or a consumption smoothing plan, but realize later that that wasn't the right choice and may revise those plans later. So these are all the types of determinants of revision we're going to be looking at. Why are these important to differentiate among? Let me just expand on what I said earlier. First of all, it's important to understand these different determinants because they affect the design of commitment devices. So for example, if we think social pressure is important, and in the case, for example, if we might find that social pressure was actually exclusively important and it actually wasn't about self-control or present bias, then we might want to design commitment devices to shield money from one's social network, but not from oneself. So basically, if there's no self-control problem, why shield money from yourself? Simply shield it from the social network, and then that actually gives the person flexibility to use the money for something else in case a shock does happen. So that could be, that's one sort of design implication. And secondly, and just as importantly, it affects our welfare analysis of commitment devices. In particular, this is related to whether shocks and mistakes are important determinants of revision. So to the extent that shocks or mistakes lead people to revise their previous choices, their previous plans, then the welfare impact of commitment devices has to be smaller because tying one's hands reduces one's flexibility in terms of responding to shocks or reversing mistakes that one might have made previously. And finally, it affects design of other policies or interventions that we might want to implement to help people stick to their previous plans. So if we think mistakes are important, then that can give greater weight towards policies that educate people about how to make financial plans. And if we think shocks are important, this provides additional justification for insurance, social insurance, for example, or even private insurance to help people better cope with shocks. So if we find that shocks are important and are keeping people from smoothing consumption appropriately over the course of the hungry season, this could mean that providing social insurance might actually help people better stick with their consumption smoothing plans over the hungry season. With that as a preliminary, let me tell you what we did in rural Malawi. We got a sample of about 1,100 husband-wife pairs. And the husband-wife pairs is an important design because we want to look at the impact of spousal preferences on revision decisions by the other spouse. The first thing we do in the baseline is we measure the extent of present bias preferences. And the method we use is Andreoni and Sprenger's newly developed convex time budget method, or CTB method, which I'll show you right now. With large real stakes. So this is for real money. The amount of money that we're giving people to play with is about 2,000 kwacha, about 14 US, equivalent to about a month's worth of day labor wages in this context. So what do people do in this using this CTB method? Just to say, the headline about how this method differs from previous methods that have been used to measure present bias is that individuals are allowed to make choices to optimize over a convex budget set. So basically, they allocate a continuous or almost continuous amount of money between one time period and the next, as opposed to what Andreoni and Sprenger refer to as the multiple price list method, where individuals are asked about binary comparisons between whether you want $100 now versus $110 in 30 days in a sequence that eventually finds an indifference point. So in this method, subjects allocate 20 tokens to a sooner time, which we call time t, versus a later time, 30 days later, t plus 30. Tokens are worth 100 kwacha each, and so if you kept all of the tokens for the sooner period, you get 2,000 kwacha. That's the $14. And we work with 5 different. There's always a rate of return for waiting until later, and to get a bit more variation, we work with 5 different rates of return. The individuals make choices between what we call a near period, in a near period, which is a choice between 1 day later and 31 days later. And they also make identical choices, but referring to what we call a far period, which is basically shifted away in time by 60 days. Basically time t is 61 days in this case, and time t plus 30 is 91 days from now. The first point to make is that this isn't going to be our main point, but this allows a nice, for the purpose of people interested in measuring time preference, this is a nice way to measure discount rates that has a number of advantages vis-a-vis the multiple price list method. I'm not really going to go into that right now because that's not our key concern with this paper. But what our interest is the ability of this method to very easily and quickly identify present bias, and in fact in a continuous manner, more continuous manner than other methods allow. And basically, to identify present bias in an individual's choices, all we need to ask is whether an individual allocates more money to sooner in the near period than they allocate to sooner in the far period, controlling for the interest rate. So if I allocate 1,000 kwacha to sooner in the near period for the first rate of return 10%, and I allocate only 500 or 0 to sooner in the far period, that would indicate a person we would call that a present bias allocation. Okay, so that's the method in brief. And the first thing that comes out of this that we emphasize a bit more in the paper that I'll be showing with you today is that it just gives a nice measure, we think, of present bias preferences just on the basis of the baseline interaction. But the real innovation that we bring to the literature is this third bullet point here, is that we revisit individuals prior to the FAR period. The FAR period is days 61 to 91. And we actually give them the opportunity to revise that allocation, the allocations they originally made. And the extent of that revision is our dependent variable. So they made the plan that I've been referring to in an abstract sense is precisely this plan, this allocation of consumption between 61 days and 91 days in the FAR period. Important to keep in mind the context. The context of this is the very last months of the hungry season in Malawi. So this is a period when household stores are at their lowest point on average throughout the country, and equally so in this area of central Malawi, this farming area of central Malawi. It's right before the next crop is going to come in, and there's an extreme need to smooth resources over these 2 months, basically March and April in the hungry season. And we're going to be looking at revisions in that plan that happen when we revisit people. I should mention these revisits were unexpected, so people initially thought that they were making a committed plan between day 61 and day 91, and we surprised them with this revisit. So we examined correlates of this revision decision, basically variables representing these 4 different potential determinants of revision. And one thing I should mention that we explicitly randomized was we examined the impact of the lag before first disbursement. So basically, we revisit people a randomized number of days prior to day 61, basically, when they're going to get that first chunk of money, anywhere from 2 to 16 days prior. The theory would predict that if people are present biased, the closer they are to the first disbursement of money, in other words, the lower the lag before the first disbursement, the more likely that is going to make people to revise money towards the present. And this is actually, this is sort of similar to, in spirit, to the examination that Supreet presented on yesterday, looking at the impact of day of the week being paid on labor supply. Sort of very similar in spirit to that. Just to sort of make clear, so our contribution again is to examine a fundamental behavior of interest, revision of a previous decision that hasn't been examined before. Important advantage is that even naive individuals contribute to estimates. There's no degree of sophistication that's required to actually contribute to our estimates. In contrast to studies that use demand for commitment as the dependent variable. And secondly, we examine a range of determinants of revision behavior so that we can quantify their relative importance. So what do we find? First of all, you'll be happy to hear that individuals seem to be sensible in the allocations they're making. We look across different rates of return, and it does look like, as the law of demand would predict, people do allocate less to sooner and choose to wait for a bigger fraction of their pot when they are faced with higher rates of return. I won't focus too much. This is probably the last thing to say about this, but that's a basic fact about just their initial allocations. Another basic fact about their initial allocations, when we first asked them about these to make these choices, I've mentioned that one can easily look at present bias just on the basis of their initial choices. Intertemporal preference reversals are frequent, so changes in allocations from the near period to the far period are frequent, but they're actually only very slightly more likely to be present biased versus future biased. In other words, allocating, making a change in choices that's the opposite of what hyperbolic preferences would imply. So there's one important difference vis-a-vis the multiple price list method as well. Andrione and Sprenger find this as well, that there's less present bias measured on average. In fact, they also find no aggregate present bias compared to multiple price list methods. Having said that, there's certainly heterogeneity within the population, which is still something which allows us to still examine the impact of present bias on people's choices. Okay, now turning to the revision behavior, that's our key dependent variable of interest. When we ask people to revise, revisions are common. About 2/3 of people do revise their original choices, and usually the revisions are substantial in size, but they're not all in the present bias direction. They're about equal numbers of revisions to later as there are to sooner when we revisit people. Last couple of results. We actually do find what we think is strong support for the existence of present bias preferences. So in this sense, we're very much in line with the previous literature. But we add, so the first thing we show is that initial allocations, the revision towards sooner, present biased revisions, are higher when people's initial allocations in the baseline are present bias. So basically the present bias measure that I showed you earlier is positively correlated with the likelihood of revising and the extent of revision towards the present. So that's very much, and now sort of in the same spirit as previous evidence like Ashraf, Carler, and Yin, consistent with the evidence that looks at demand for commitment as a dependent variable. But we add a new piece of evidence, which is this time lag to disbursement, which we randomized. We also find that the closer our revisit date is, the closer the revision decision is to the actual date of first disbursement, the more individuals allocate towards sooner. So basically, people seem to be much more tempted to move allocations to the present when that present is much closer at hand. And finally, the other sort of quite robust result that we find is that spousal preferences are strongly associated with revision. So this is the first type of evidence of this sort. But basically, we have because we do the same measurements of present bias or same CTB allocation for both the husband and the wife separately. We can actually see how spousal preferences, how the preferences of the spouse affect this revision decision. So, in other words, if your spouse actually would have wanted more money in day 61 than day 91 than you initially allocated, then in fact, when we give you the opportunity to revise, you revise it in precisely that direction. You bring more money to the present. Okay, finally, shocks in financial sophistication do not predict revisions, as it turns out. So it doesn't look like, at least in this context, in this data, that shocks or mistakes which were taken to be proxied for by financial sophistication, are an important determinant of revisions. And so this has a, I think the implication is that this is actually good news for welfare analysis of commitment savings devices or other types of commitment devices, that it doesn't seem that if you offered commitment devices to this population in this context, in this time period, that they would be substantially limited in their flexibility to handle shocks or mistakes to their initial allocations. Okay. Let me, if I have 15 minutes, so I'm actually not going to go through the gory details of the experiment. You're welcome to read the paper for those. But what I will say is that, in case you're worried about order effects, one thing we did randomize in the paper is the order in which people made choices over the near period versus the far period. So we randomized that across individuals, and that turns out not to have any effect on the present bias measure or any other measures or any other results that we look at. Once a respondent and a spouse made an allocation, this was a real choice in the sense that one out of the combined set of choices that a spousal pair made was randomly selected to be actually implemented in the far period. I'm sorry, not in the far period, but just across either the near or the far period. So basically, you can think of this as basically randomizing either the husband or the wife's choice to be implemented, and then within that person's choice, one of the 10 was actually implemented. Now, if someone's near choice was the one that actually got implemented, there was actually no revision possibility because that near choice was happening, the disbursements were happening in the next 1 or 31 days. So our sample for looking at revision decisions is the people who were randomly allocated to the far period. And that we actually weighted things so that ended up being 2/3 of our original sample. This is just a graphic illustrating sort of physically what people were doing when they were making these choices. We had a dish, and 2 dishes in front of them. The first dish representing the allocation at time t, the next the allocation at time t plus 30. They had a bowl with the 20 tokens in front of them, and they basically allocated across the 2 dishes, and we had our survey staff. Those squares up there are supposed to represent a whiteboard. Survey staff used a whiteboard to write down for people how much that actually translated to in money. It was much more straightforward for the first period. We just had to multiply by 100, but where there was a rate of return, we didn't want any sort of calculation errors to get in the way. So we actually made explicit to people what those allocations meant in terms of money, and we allowed people to revise as many times in this initial allocation before coming up with a final decision. So here's just an example of a man making an allocation. The man on the left is the subject, and in this, the woman on the right is the subject. And again, we did it for a husband and a wife in each household. And then the only other thing that I would emphasize is, we unexpectedly revisited people in an interval randomized on the day level between 2 and 16 days prior to the first disbursement. And in terms of the revision decision, the main thing I'll emphasize is that we made their initial allocation very clear and salient by basically showing them with cups in front of them what they had originally allocated. So we actually looked up in our data for each individual and said, okay, this is what you originally allocated. Would you like to make any changes? And that's just because we weren't interested we're not interested here in measuring the stability of time preference, but rather, the actual revision behavior. So this reduces noise and really sort of helps make sure that these are conscious decisions to revise vis-a-vis previous allocations. And we use surveys to measure, at both stages to measure our sort of right-hand side variables of interest, including shocks to income and deaths in the family. And in the revision decision, so this is basically just illustrating the revision decision. We presented them with their original allocation in one set of plates, and then we allowed them to revise their decision in a second set of plates using a different set of tokens. Here's the timeline. We do the baseline interview at day 0. First possible disbursement of funds is at day 1. Second possible disbursement of funds is day 31. This is the near period. And then the far period is days 61 to 91. And we revisit here in days 46 through 59. Okay. In the interest of time, I'll just give you a sense of the how much people typically allocated to sooner. So these rates of return are very high, anywhere from 10% to 100% over just a month. So the fact that, in some sense, the fact that people are allocating anything to sooner is actually quite striking. I mean, they're on average allocating less than half to sooner, but they're still allocating substantial amounts. One thing that's, as you would predict by the law of demand, people are allocating less to sooner as the rate of return for waiting gets higher. If you compare the near period with the corresponding allocation in the far period, you can already see here there's not substantial present bias. People are allocating a little bit more to sooner in the near period than in the far period, but not substantially so. And if you compare the medians, the lack of difference is even more striking. Okay, now turning to the revision decision, these are the initial allocations to sooner in the far period. And these are basically going to be the initial allocations that get revised. So the biggest chunk of allocations to sooner is 0, 17%, but there's substantial, 83% allocate something to sooner, so there's substantial scope for revision in either direction for that matter. And these are the actual revisions. So, the biggest chunk of revisions, the biggest category is no change. That's 35% of individuals, and about a similar number make positive revisions. In other words, revisions toward the present, bring money toward the present, as make revisions towards later, pushing money away from them in time. So here's the first key result. I present this first because it's the one thing that we actually randomized, or actually one out of two things where we had explicitly exogenous variation, and that is the day to first disbursement. So again, our prediction is the closer our revision date and the individual's revision decision is to the actual day of first disbursement, the more likely they are to bring money toward the present, and that's precisely what we found. It turns out, I'm not going to show you all the gory details, but if you look at the sort of the data at a much finer level, it's quite clear that this is actually a step function. So this is not a linear relationship. It's basically more or less that the effect is about the same if you revisit anywhere between 2 to 6 days prior to the first disbursement. So basically, if the first disbursement of money is going to be within 2 to 6 days, we see about 142 additional kwacha brought towards the present. That's about $1. And basically no effect of being anywhere further, anything outside of that window on revisions towards the present. And this difference here, this 142, is clearly statistically significantly different from the effect of being some number of days later from first disbursement. So let me just show you the key regression results. So the dependent variable here, all you need to know is in this one regression, and then everything else is sort of commentary. But basically, the dependent variable is the change in sooner consumption, so how much money you bring toward the present upon revisiting. First, the first thing to look at is the present bias ratio. So this is the share. The dependent variable, the right-hand side variable here is the share of those five sets of choices across interest rates that involve present bias, where basically the allocation to sooner in the near period is higher than the allocation to sooner in the far period. So it ranges from 0 to 1. There's a positive and significant coefficient on that at the 10% level. So people who are more present biased. So this is the result that's in concord with the previous literature, like the demand for commitment work of Ashraf, Carlin, and Yin. That higher, the measure of present bias is positively correlated with a behavior that appears to be with present bias behavior, namely revision towards the present in this case. The second variable here is basically a measure of financial sophistication. Has a funny name, adherence to law of demand ratio, but basically it's just the extent to which your allocations toward sooner decline in the interest rate that we offered you. So basically, are you following the law of demand in those allocations? That measure is not significantly associated with revisions, and we take that as an indication that financial sophistication, which may be a proxy for mistakes, doesn't appear to be influencing revisions. The other, yeah.
What proportion are ones there?
In the adherence to the law of demand ratio, here you go. 30% make a completely consistent. Yeah, that's the answer. And then it's a continuous variable. Here's the result for days to first disbursement. I already showed you that on the graphic. Here's the spousal pressure result. the more your spouse prefers a sooner allocation than you do, the more you revise towards the present. So basically for every, the coefficient of 0.16 is easily interpreted for every kwacha more that your spouse prefers a present biased or a sooner allocation, you allocate 0.16 additional kwacha towards the present when you revise. Shocks and shortfalls in income aren't significantly associated. And finally, just to scale these different variables, we look at the implemented rate of return, basically, what's the rate of return on the choice that you were randomized to, and that, as we would expect, has a significantly negative relationship with revision. So basically, the greater the return to weighting, the less likely you are to shift allocations towards the present as you when we revisit you. In case you are interested in I mentioned that equal numbers of people are present biased and quote-unquote future biased in our data. In case you're interested, you'll be happy to know that, I think many people will be happy to know that if we run the same regression but replace present bias with future bias, that in fact has no significant relationship with revisions, and in fact it goes in the opposite direction that you might expect. We think that's comforting and doesn't introduce additional weird things to explain. It'd be hard to explain. Differences between males and females might be of interest to some people. Unfortunately, we don't have a large enough sample to really say much about this. Basically, if you run the regression separately for males and females, results are quite similar across males and females, and there are no statistically significant differences in the effects across the male or female samples for any of these results. Last thing I want to say is just to give a sense of the relative impacts of the key determinants that we look at. So the thing that we want to take as a comparison is to start off with just the implemented rate of return. So when the rate of return to weighting varies, how does that affect people's decisions to revise allocations towards the present? So think about a 50 percentage point reduction, which is actually a huge change in the rate of return. That leads to more revisions towards the present to the tune of about 100 kwacha. So basically, this is the sort of benchmark that you might want to be thinking about. And the key point is that all of the right-hand side factors that I emphasized in the regression are substantial in magnitude vis-a-vis this very large change in the implemented rate of return. So a change in the present bias ratio amounting to 1 standard deviation, which is a reasonably sized change, leads to an additional 43 kwacha allocated towards the present. Moving into the window of 2 to 6 days prior to first disbursement has an actually larger effect, 130 kwacha. Additional revision allocations to sooner, and finally about a 1 standard deviation in increase in this spousal bias or spousal pressure variable leads to a similarly sized effect, about 114 kwacha more towards the present. So the key point of this slide is that these effects that we're estimating are substantial vis-a-vis the market-oriented effects that we might expect from this very large change in the rate of return to weighting. So let me just wrap up. So again, what do we have here? We've got what we think is the first direct evaluation of the link between time preferences under commitment and revisions of previous choices. And we basically find two sets of results. First of all, as theory predicts and in concordance with previous literature, we do find that present bias dynamic inconsistency does predict revision behavior. As does, and this is the newer thing, the time lag to first disbursement, the time lag to the actual consumption experience. In addition, spousal preferences are strongly associated with revisions, and this may suggest a role for devices to shield resources from spouses, but not from self. One thing I want to say, of course, is that just to be clear, we fully recognize that we didn't randomize spousal preferences in this experiment. What we did generate exogenous variation in is, first of all, in the implemented rate of return to weighting and in the time lag to first disbursement. So this result on spousal preferences is more a correlation result as opposed to a causation result. I want to be clear about that. But I think it does point the way towards future research that can actually try to get more causal identification in that effect. And we have a number of ideas that we're already pursuing along those lines. Finally, shocks and mistakes don't seem to be important determinants of revision, which is good news for the welfare impact of commitment devices. The flexibility that is lost when you offer someone and they take up a commitment device doesn't, at least in this population, doesn't seem likely to lead to significant welfare losses. So thank you, and looking forward to the discussion period.
Well, we'll go against the old dictum and switch deans in mid-session. So, Dean, let's go.
Do you want this?